Yoon sets off for Spain to attend the NATO summit in Madrid. He'll hold a string of bilateral talks with other world leaders and a three-way summit with Washington and Tokyo, marking his debut on the multilateral diplomatic arena. The leaders of the Group of 7 nations began a 3-day summit in Germany on Sunday. At the top of their agenda is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The G7 agrees to ban imports of Russian gold, while Moscow steps up missile attacks on Kyiv. South Korean female golfer Chun In-gee wins her 3rd LPGA Major Championship award, scoring a victory in the final round at the KPMG Women's PGA in Maryland on Sunday.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Monday, June 27th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Lee Seung-jae.
And I'm Oh Soo-young. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Over the next hour, we'll be providing you some of the look at biggest headlines of the day and experts' insights on key issues facing South Korea and the rest of the world. South Korean President Yoon will depart for Spain on Monday for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization summit set for Wednesday and Thursday.
That's right. And during the trip, which will mark his debut on the multilateral diplomatic stage since taking office last month, Yoon will take part in a trilateral summit with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts. Kim Yo-sun with our top story.
The leaders of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will sit down for a trilateral summit on Wednesday in Spain on the sidelines of a NATO summit. No such trilateral summit has taken place for the past 5 years or so amid strained ties between Seoul and Tokyo. Yet relations between the two Asian neighbors have shown signs of improvement since Yoon took office as South Korea's president, pledging to improve ties with Japan. While there was speculation that Yoon could hold a one-on-one meeting with his Japanese counterpart in Spain, no such meeting, whether in the form of an official summit or a pool-aside meeting, is likely to take place. During the scheduled trilateral summit, the three countries are expected to discuss an array of issues, including the security situation on the Korean peninsula. There are a total of 14 diplomatic functions scheduled for Yoon in Madrid, including the NATO summit, during which he will underscore the importance of the denuclearization of North Korea. While Seoul is not a member of the military alliance, it has been invited as a partner along with other countries such as Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Yoon is also expected to hold a series of bilateral meetings with leaders from Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, and Denmark to discuss ways to expand economic cooperation. First Lady Kim Gun-hee plans to accompany Yoon on his first overseas visit. She plans to attend sessions for the leaders' spouses and other events, including a guided tour of the royal palace, as well as a dinner with Korean residents in Spain. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
The G7 summit officially kicked off in Germany on Sunday, with leaders discussing the war in Ukraine as well as its far-reaching consequences from energy shortages to a food crisis. The leaders of the world's 7 richest democracies announced an attempt to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative by raising some $600 billion for global infrastructure programs in poor countries. They have also agreed to ban the import of Russian gold, with the aim of further tightening sanctions on Moscow amid its war with Ukraine. On the second day of the summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is scheduled to virtually address the leaders.
Again, with the world leaders gathering for the G7 summit in Germany to discuss further sanctions on Moscow, Russia has ramped up attacks on Ukraine. Russian missiles hit an apartment block as well as a kindergarten in the capital city of Kyiv on Sunday, marking the first such attack there in weeks. The city's deputy mayor says 1 person was killed and 6 others wounded. Russian missiles also struck the central city of Cherkasy, killing 1 person and destroying a strategic bridge linking western Ukraine and the eastern battlefields. Now, Ukraine's military officials say the attacks were carried out using long-range missiles fired from Russian bombers more than 1,000 kilometers away. Now, there's also extreme heat right now in countries around the world, in part because of climate change. There was a hot one here in the Korean capital, Seoul, with the overnight low the highest in 25 years. Severe heat waves in the U.S. and Japan as well. Lee Dae-hyun has more.
This weekend has been a scorcher in parts of Europe, the U.S., and Asia. In Spain and France, it got above 40 degrees Celsius. In the United States, more than 20 million people were under heat alerts in 16 states. Northern and central China got into the 40s as well, with the authorities advising people to avoid activities outdoors. Heavy rains caused flooding in China's south, disrupting the lives of nearly 500,000 people. The south of China has seen its worst flooding in decades, with Guangdong province on Tuesday raising its alert to the highest level after days of rainfall. In Japan on Saturday, more than 60 regions, including Tokyo, saw temperatures higher than 35 degrees. According to Yomiuri Shimbun, this is the earliest in the summer for it to get that hot in Tokyo since data were first compiled in 1875. The Korean capital of Seoul on Sunday recorded its highest overnight low in 25 years. It never got below 24.6 degrees. In the city Incheon, the overnight low was the highest in 117 years. Decades-long records broken in other cities too. Heat waves are a phenomenon that's been occurring more frequently in recent years around the world, as shown by a study by the American Meteorological Society. The average number of days between May and September with at least one large heat wave in the Northern Hemisphere has doubled from 73 in the 1980s to 152 in the 2010s. And the number of days with 2 or more heat waves in different parts of the hemisphere was 7 times higher. Some scientists say more extreme weather events will accompany these heat waves. They say a slowdown of air currents can cause heat waves to last longer as temperature differences narrow, keeping weather systems from moving around the planet. They warn global warming could lead to disease, death, and poor harvests, which could aggravate global food shortages. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. In January of last year, the National Assembly passed the Serious Accident Punishment Act, which imposes criminal liability on individuals and entities responsible for serious accidents, which, by the way, came into effect 6 months ago today.
But has the law changed the working conditions for those at greater risk of serious accidents at work, especially in the construction field? We find out as we connect with Kim Seung-jin, attorney at DRN Aju LLC. Very good morning to you. And well, first off, can you give us the key points to the Serious Accident Punishment Act, or SAPA, which came into effect 6 months ago?
Before I tell you about the key points of the SAPA, I'd like to briefly explain why it was enacted in Korea a year and a half ago. We've had the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, since the early 1980s, but industrial accidents have not decreased. The Korean parliament researched why industrial accidents are not decreasing and concluded that it's because not the CEO, but the plant manager or the head of a contractor is responsible for industrial accidents. So the Korean parliament enacted a new act to decrease industrial accidents by holding CEOs criminally liable for industrial accidents. About the key points of the SAPA, the most important point is that the CEOs are now responsible for industrial accidents, as I just mentioned. Another important point is that the SAPA protects not only employees, but also every person who works for the employer for its business. That means that a worker doesn't have to have a direct labor relationship with the employer. According to the previous act, only employees who have a labor relationship with their employers were protected. Yet another important point is that the place where the SAPA is applied is broadened. According to the SAPA, as long as the industrial accident occurs during the course of business, that the employer effectively governs, operates, or manages, the accident is protected by the SAPA. According to the previous act, only the industrial accidents which occurred in the workplace were protected. So motorcycle accidents that occur in the course of food delivery are now protected by the SAPA.
So, like we mentioned, while the law was, again, put in place to protect workers, employers were sort of opposed to the introduction of this very law. Can you tell us why they were actually against the law?
Well, employers have been against the SAPA since it's holding employers criminally liable with so many unclear terminologies. The first thing I'd like to mention as an unclear terminology is responsible management personnel, or the RMP. The RMP is a very important terminology since most obligations and punishments under the SAPA are targeting the RMPs. However, the SAPA is not stipulating who's included in the RMPs. The second thing I'd like to mention is relevant laws related to safety and health. The SAPA is mentioning relevant laws related to safety and health here and there, but companies are having a hard time finding out what are relevant laws related to safety and health, since each company has a different business. Thirdly, the SAPA is emphasizing effective domination, operation, and management, but it's really hard to tell what can be evaluated to be effective domination, operation, and management. Last but not least, under the OSHA, a company that ordered construction work does not have to perform the safety and health obligations unless the company generally manages, oversees the construction work. In this situation, it's unclear which safety and health obligations under the SAPA are applied to a company that ordered construction work but does not generally manage and oversee the construction work.
Well, it seems that both unions and businesses have been quite unhappy with this law, given its vagueness that you mentioned, and the Yoon administration's been seeking to revise it, of course. But have we seen any positive impacts of this law since it came into effect?
The Ministry of Employment Labor published a statistical report last May regarding death cases caused by industrial accident in the first quarter of this year. According to the report, the death toll in the first quarter of this year decreased by 8. So if we look at the official death toll, the overall working conditions in Korea have been slightly improving since the SAPA came into effect last January. What's quite interesting in the report is that the death toll in the workplaces where the SAPA is not applied is not decreasing. The SAPA is not applied to workplaces with less than 50 regular employees or less than 5 billion won construction costs. For those small workplaces, the SAPA is applied from January 2024. About the major cases involving the SAPA, I'd like to briefly explain the first case that was passed on to the prosecution. The first case occurred at Doosan Industrial Company, which is an air conditioner parts manufacturer in Changwon. Last February, 16 employees of the company suffered acute poisoning due to chloroform, which was used to clean air conditioner parts. According to the investigation of the Office on Employment and Labor, the company used too much chloroform to clean air conditioner parts. The amount of used chloroform was 6 times the standard of permission. Last April, the Office of Employment Labor sent this case to the prosecution with the opinion of an indictment. The prosecution is currently reviewing the case to decide whether to indict.
So again, it does seem like there's the good and the bad right now, but the fact is it's only been 6 months since the law did come into effect. So, I mean, do you think the law is good enough to protect the workers at this point, or is there a need for more improvements so that would make surely everyone happy?
Well, even if the SAPA is an important law to protect workers, it alone is not good enough to protect workers. So legislators are discussing other laws to further protect workers. What's currently much discussed is the Decrepit Facilities Act. According to the Korea Industrial Complex Corporation, most casualties in the industrial complexes occurred in decrepit industrial complexes which were developed more than 20 years ago. For example, 3 workers were injured by an explosion accident last month in Yeosu Industrial Complex, which was developed more than 50 years ago. In addition, last February, 8 casualties occurred in an explosion accident in the same industrial complex. In this situation, a member of parliament proposed that the Decrepit Facilities Act is necessary to protect workers. According to the proposal, not only the company which owns decrepit facilities, which were built more than 20 years ago, but also the central and local governments can manage the decrepit facilities. According to the proposal, local governments can open management and improvement plan for decrepit facilities to the public and ask for investigation or directly investigate decrepit facilities. However, since the act is restricting the right to private property, the backlash from employers is quite obvious. So whether the act can be really enacted is very uncertain at the moment.
Kim Seung-jin, attorney at DR and Aju LLC, thank you very much for your insights this morning.
Thank you.
All right, with that, that's going to wrap up the first half of New Day at Arirang.
But do stick around for the second half with new challenges to global security. What role can South Korea play as it aims to become a global pivotal state? That's coming up for you on Global Insight, so don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
Protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
넌 볼 수 없고 가질 수 없어 뚝뚝 눈물 쏟아내도 뜨거운 자태 한번 비추지 않고 내게만 가치란 그녀는 유명한 서울의 별다 어딨나 In your eye 걔와 함께면 넌 디스토피아 내 발걸음 따라오면 유토피아 나의
I feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
And welcome back to the second half of New Day at Arirang. South Korean golfer Chun In-gee has won her third major women's PGA championship.
Her latest win wasn't an easy one as she rallied back in the final round to claim her title. Jeong has more.
South Korean golf player Chun In-gee has won a major women's PGA championship for the third time. At the Congressional Country Club's Blue Course in Bethesda, Maryland on Sunday local time, Chun took first place at the KPMG Women's PGA Championship. Finishing on a 5 under 283, Chun, a 27-year-old from South Korea, held off Lexi Thompson of the United States and Min-ji Lee of Australia by one shot. Chun overcame a bogey-filled front nine and closed her victory by taking a 3-stroke lead into the final round with a 3 over 75. She was leading by 6 shots at the tournament's halfway point, but stumbled to a 75 in the third round and lost her 3-shot advantage after just 3 holes in the final round. Chun regained her lead on the 17th and won her third championship with a clutch par putt on the final hole. Winning her first major at the U.S. Women's Open in 2015, she has held the Champions Trophy with 4 LPGA wins, with 3 of them coming at majors. It's her first tour victory since October 2018, ending South Korea's title drought in big tournaments after 7 attempts. 엄지영, 아리랑 뉴스.
For the first time in 3 years, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the swimming pools in Seoul along the Han River are open again. And it's just in time for the summer heat. Chun In-gee went to check it out.
The summer monsoon has officially begun, which for some brings welcome relief from the stifling heat.
Apart from enjoying the rain, there's another perfect way for people to cool off in Seoul, swimming on the banks of the Hangang River.
These riverside pools have reopened for the first time in 3 years after being closed due to the pandemic.
We had to close the swimming pools for the past 2 years because of COVID-19. We decided to reopen them after social distancing rules were eased.
Splash pools are now open at Hangang parks in Nanji and Yanghwa, and swimming pools are open in Yeouido, Jamwon, Tukseom, and Gwangnaru. They are not only cool summer getaways in the city, but also very affordable ones. Adults can enjoy the pool for around the price of a coffee at just 5,000 won, which is less than $4. And it costs even less for children and those wishing to visit splash pools.
We're feeling great. Compared to water parks, it's cheaper and much closer to my house. I want to come every week.
It's cheap and we can eat freely outside. It feels like we are out on a picnic.
Although mask wearing is not a must for people when outdoors, they are strongly advised to wear them, especially when areas get crowded. And people should remember that masks have to be put back on when they're going inside to buy snacks or change their clothes. These riverside attractions are open every day from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. until mid-August. Chun In-gee, Arirang News.
Now, last Tuesday, South Korea successfully launched its homegrown space rocket into space and put actual satellites into orbit. An achievement President Yoon extolled, calling it the product of 3 decades of effort. Our Kim Do-yeon and Han Sung-woo were on site covering the launch. Here's a video log of their coverage.
All right, this is going to be your first rocket launch. How are you feeling?
Very excited, a bit nervous actually. We're gonna be on site for a historic launch, right? The second launch of Nuri. It's something I've only seen in the movies, Tom Hanks, Apollo 13, but to actually be there, what an exciting experience it'll be.
All right, let's go.
All right.
Despite all this excitement, about an hour into the drive south, we got some news. The Korea Aerospace Research Institute decided to push back the launch by 24 hours due to the weather, just minutes before Arirang TV's first newscast of the day, and we had to stop at a rest point to break the story.
The scheduled second launch of the Nuri space rocket, which was set to take place on Wednesday, has been delayed to Thursday.
That's right.
Today's weather forecast posed obstacles to the transportation of the rocket. And once it's erected, the screening of umbilical cords and connecting the cables could have been dangerous for the engineers.
Nuri stands almost 50 meters tall, and the engineers will be working from the umbilical tower exposed to potential risks. The cables mentioned would be crucial in connecting the rocket to the control room. The umbilical cords would provide the fuel and oxidizers needed for the launch. The engineers also assure the public that there are no problems with the rocket itself. And it showed, as after the 24-hour delay, all steps seemed to be on course.
Addressing the press at the time, officials cautiously concluded they feel good about Nuri's chances for Thursday, with the weather forecast also in the rocket's favor.
We think it's highly likely the launch will be a success. Then again, there's no guarantee that unexpected variables won't pop up last minute, so we're not letting down our guard.
All right, 1 day left. Tomorrow, Nuri-ho will be going on its second launch. And now, today, what it'll be doing is it'll be moved, transported to the launch pad through a transporter vehicle. That'll happen at 7:20 a.m. That's what we're going to cover today. The weather's looking a bit foggy. It's not raining, though, and it's not windy either. And yesterday, the Korea Aerospace Research Institute did say that they feel good about the weather moving forward. So I'm looking forward to seeing it being moved to the launch pad. And that's where all the umbilical cables, electrical cables will be connected. And 1 day left, people. So tomorrow, At around 4 p.m., the exact time is yet to be decided, but that's when Nuri-ho will be soaring into the skies and sending actual satellites into orbit, hopefully if it succeeds on its mission.
And the transportation process went smoothly, with hardly any wind. The sun shining bright and Nuri standing fully upright on its launch pad by around 11 a.m. Wednesday. Then, another sudden announcement a day before liftoff. A technical glitch detected at around 2 p.m. in the oxidizer level sensor in the rocket's first stage meant Nuri had to be transported from the launch pad back to where it was assembled.
After trying to figure out the issue at the launch pad, we realized it was not possible to get up close and analyze the problem while it's standing up. That's why we decided it's impossible to carry out the launch at the moment.
Too bad Nuri can't be launched on Thursday.
Yeah, look on the bright side though. What a relief the issue was detected. We can always come back for the coverage when the rocket is in tip-top shape.
True. I mean, it's not a failed launch. The cancellation itself just shows how many checks there are.
Yeah, we'll just have to see when the next launch date is, and hopefully it happens soon, and we'll be back for it.
Well, I guess that wraps up our on-site coverage for now then.
That's right. Let's pack up and get back home.
But just when it seemed as though it would be postponed for several weeks, Nuri's launch was suddenly back on.
At first, we thought Nuri's first and second stages would have to be separated to replace the problematic sensor itself, but researchers at the Korea Aerospace Research Institute, after close examination, found the issue could be solved by replacing just one key part that was malfunctioning.
Replacing the sensor's core and not the sensor itself was enough to do the job, removing the need for them to disassemble the rocket and allowing the country to launch Nuri within its alternative launch window, ending June 23rd.
Well, Song, it's great to hear that everything's going to plan thus far. No one wants to see another delay, least of all you, I'd imagine, because you've been up and down between there and Seoul for the past number of days. But what exactly is the plan between right now and the launch that's due to happen in around 4 hours from now?
Well, beginning around 4 hours before the launch, that's about right now, assuming no irregularities arise during last-minute inspections, the fuel and oxidizer charging process will begin, after which the erector keeping Nuri stable on its launch pad will be removed.
And so it happened. One more trip to the launch pad, fuel injection, pre-launch operation, and finally 3, 2, 1, liftoff. With the roar, the ground shook before Nuri, powered by 4 first-stage 75-ton liquid fuel engines, blasted into space.
Now, Sungwoo, what a sight that was. I mean, Nuri blasting off into space. I imagine the NATO Space Center was in high spirits and currently is in high spirits right now.
The 3-stage space rocket, after reaching its target altitude of 700 kilometers, placed both its performance verification satellite, holding 4 functioning mini-cube satellites, and its 1.3-ton dummy satellite into orbit, 70 seconds apart at around 4:15 p.m.
Claps of joy ensued, and an hour later, the Korea Aerospace Research Institute and the Ministry of Science and ICT held a joint presser on site, declaring mission accomplished.
Nuri reached its target altitude and successfully placed the performance satellite into orbit.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol watched the event from his office in Yongsan-gu District, Seoul. He called it a product of 30 years of effort and promised more support for the country's space program.
정부도 제가 공약에서 말씀드린 바와 같이 항공우주청을 설치해서 이 항공우주 산업을 체계적으로 지원하겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 정말 수고 많으셨습니다.
With 4 more launches scheduled by 2027, our crew left NATO Space Center the following morning, knowing that though the Nuri project is far from over, South Korea's space endeavors have only just begun.
From the NATO Space Center in Gohung, Jeollanam-do Province,
that was Kim Do-yeon,
Hansung, Arirang News.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. With South Korea aiming to play a greater role in world affairs beyond its own immediate security concerns caused by North Korea's nuclear program, Seoul is actively involving itself in global initiatives and discussions under the Yoon administration. We discuss today South Korea's expanding realm of foreign policy and its goal of becoming a global pivotal state to reinforce liberal democratic values in the world order. And joining us for this discussion in studio today is Stephen Wertheim, Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an author and historian. Mr. Wertheim is one of the world's top opinion leaders of US foreign policy and contemporary world issues. And it's a pleasure and an honour to have you in our studio today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
And well, first of all, Dr. Wertheim, I believe you're in Seoul. You were in Seoul for the past week to attend the World Emerging Security Forum organised by South Korea's Foreign Ministry. And well, you were part of a discussion on cybersecurity, which some see as revolutionising warcraft and military postures all around the world. So, well, first of all, what was your main takeaways from that forum?
Well, the World Emerging Security Forum is held to bring greater attention to some unconventional challenges that the world faces in common. Cybersecurity, global health, and climate were at the center of this year's forum, which people can watch on YouTube, no less. And, you know, I think the takeaway for me was how difficult it is becoming now to have effective international cooperation. We've seen geopolitical divisions harden in the world after events that could have been unified. The pandemic could have been something that brought humanity together against a disease that we all faced. The war in Ukraine, an illegal invasion of a sovereign country, again, something that could have brought much of the world together, and it's brought some of the world together. But what we've seen happen, we've seen a kind of X-ray about where we stand as a global community over the last few years, and we found out that unfortunately we are more divided than we have been in the past several decades. So I think that will make effective cooperation more difficult. It'll make it easier to some extent for countries that are aligned with one another to cooperate. And we've seen South Korea now participating in the upcoming NATO summit. But it will also make it more challenging to prevent the motivations that cause problems in the cyber realm and other realms in the first place.
And well, speaking of South Korea's role in such discussions, I mean, efforts like holding the Security Forum, for instance, South Korea really is trying to become what it calls a global pivotal state. And how do you see Seoul's expanding role in the world?
Well, this is one of President Yoon's ways of describing his vision for Korea's foreign policy. I think, you know, the war in Ukraine has brought out some of the vulnerabilities that countries face, not just in Europe, but also here in the Asia Pacific. And so I think under the rubric of a global pivotal state, what I see President Yoon doing is trying to show how valuable Korea is to countries all around the world, not just in the realm of conventional political issues, but also in economics, such as semiconductors and supply chain security. So I think that's a part of his effort, which is symbolized by Korea's participation in the NATO summit. I also think that in light of the difficulty of getting cooperation in the United Nations around the North Korea issue, we've seen China and Russia refuse to participate in sanctions. There's a need to look for new allies and partners.
Right, and are you seeing South Korea participate more in the Quad working groups as well with the new Yoon administration?
Yeah, South Korea has stepped up its participation in the Quad. We'll see if South Korea actually joins the Quad formally or continues to participate in a more informal way. I think the big question here is just how far South Korea will go in efforts that either are or might be perceived to be aimed at constraining the power and influence of China, something that Seoul is often kind of torn between those objectives. So that remains to be determined probably by the government itself.
Well, for now, President Yoon Suk-yeol, he's jetting off on Monday to Madrid to join in the NATO summit, something that a South Korean leader hasn't done previously. So it's quite unprecedented in terms of Seoul's diplomacy there. And, well, Seoul is also planning to establish a mission to NATO as well in Brussels. And in May, just last month, it became the first Asian country to join NATO's cyber defense group. And, well, with all these moves, it seems that South Korea is pulling out all the stops to really support the US and its allies, its transatlantic allies. And as South Korea continues to align itself with this treaty, how do you see its role expanding? How do you see it cooperating with NATO?
Well, this is a good question. I don't think anyone expects South Korea or other Asian countries to join NATO. That's not in the cards, but the kind of informal participation has been increasing. South Korea is one of 4 Asia-Pacific countries that are having their heads of government attend the NATO summit this week. And I think because those countries are not going to join the defense alliance, their main contribution may be in 2 realms. One of them might be under the realm of what we might call geoeconomics, how geopolitics and economics relate. And that has to do with supply chains, climate change, the green transition, and so forth. And the other issue, I think, has to do with China, because NATO itself is going to adopt a new strategic concept in this summit, something it hasn't done since 2010. It's kind of like the national security strategy for NATO. And the last one didn't even mention China. This one is going to be very different. Of course, the threat that Russia poses to the Euro-Atlantic area will be at the top of the agenda. But I would expect China to receive substantial and significant mentions as well. And so I think the inclusion of those Asia-Pacific 4 countries is part of this effort to integrate the transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances a little bit more. Not completely, but a little bit more.
Right, so we are seeing South Korea, Australia, Japan and New Zealand join in this NATO summit. And as you sort of already mentioned, do you see the 2 traditional US allies, the groups of allies really merging together? Is this what we're going to continue to see?
I think we are seeing some movement towards not so much convergence, but towards greater integration. This is, I think, one of the reasons why several countries in Asia, including South Korea, participated in the sanctions on Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. They recognize that not just that it's a problem for the international order to have countries violating international law if it's to go without consequences, but also that something similar might occur in Asia. And that's something that no one wants to see, except potentially countries that might be the perpetrators, obviously. So I think the attempt to integrate alliances is an attempt to also think ahead to what might be a conflict across the Taiwan Strait or even on the Korean Peninsula, to make sure that there is a plan if those kinds of contingencies were to occur. On the other hand, so I think it makes sense for these U.S. alliances to be somewhat more integrated. But to some extent, the integration is an alternative to the possibility that the United States might decide to prioritize security in one region more than another. For example, one option that the United States might have would be to lower its military role in Europe, given how much more attention its European allies and partners are giving now to the threat that Russia poses, in order to allow the United States to concentrate on security in Asia, which is important, especially because of the scale of Chinese economic and military power. It's quite a bit larger than the scale of Russian power relative to the rest of Europe. So I think in some sense, the desire to integrate the alliances to some degree is an alternative to having a division of labor between the United States and Europe.
And certainly the Defense Secretary, Mr. Lloyd Austin, he said that China is going to be, the Indo-Pacific is going to be the main theatre of the US's security concerns. And, well, Mr. Biden, though, President Biden, is he going to be able to really focus on these foreign affairs issues with, of course, China and Russia being on top of his agenda when, of course, you have the November elections coming up? Do you think he's going to continue pursuing this foreign policy for the middle class?
Well, it's a little hard to know what to make of the foreign policy for the middle class at this point. A year ago, when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, that was, you might say, an accomplishment that could be under the rubric of a foreign policy for the middle class. And although the circumstances of the withdrawal were unpopular, the basic fact of the withdrawal was widely popular in the United States. But now the war in Ukraine has really thrown those plans awry. It has occupied the attention of senior leaders, inevitably so. All along in the course of the war in Ukraine, the United States government has been eager to reassure its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific that it still recognizes that the Indo-Pacific is the most important place for the United States to play a leadership role going forward. Nevertheless, you can't escape the reality of what's happening in the war in Ukraine and how it's having a global impact and a domestic impact. And now the United States has sent more than $6 billion in military aid to Ukraine since the war began. That makes Ukraine actually the largest annual recipient of U.S. security assistance in the 21st century. So I think it remains to be seen how that issue will play in American domestic politics. So far, the idea of imposing costs on Russia and supporting Ukraine, that's certainly popular in the United States. The question is, at what cost? And Americans haven't seen too much of a cost yet, but with rising inflation and energy and food prices increasing, it could become more of a problem for President Biden in the November elections and going forward as well.
Right, well, given the huge list of domestic priorities not helped by soaring inflation and costs, as you mentioned, well, how do you think President Biden is going to really pursue his foreign policy, though? Some have assumed that he's going to pursue this offshore balancing strategy, but how do you personally think that he should manage his transatlantic and Indo-Pacific affairs?
Well, I think that having more of a division of labor in America's transatlantic alliance would be a good way to go. In other words, I think something like an offshore balancing approach for the United States vis-a-vis the greater Middle East and Europe would be wise, but not the Indo-Pacific. If you look at Europe and the Middle East, it would be very difficult for any one hostile power to dominate those regions. As aggressive as Russia has shown itself to be in Eastern Europe, Russia has an economy that, by the most conservative metric, is 5 times smaller than that of the rest of Europe. Even smaller now, surely, after the sanctions. And those sanctions will continue to hit the Russian economy. So I think Europe has the ability to balance against the Russian threat. But so far, I'm not seeing signs that the United States is actually very serious about reducing its role in Europe. It's eager to cap the number of troops that it stations permanently in Europe. Right now, that's at about at 100,000. But the real concern is, what if there were to be a conflict simultaneously with Russia in Europe and China in the Indo-Pacific? That would be very hard for the United States to play the leading role simultaneously in that kind of circumstance. So I think it would be wise to look toward the future and focus on security in Asia as well as the needs of Americans at home.
Right, and one security threat in the Indo-Pacific and of immediate threat to South Korea, of course, is North Korea. And we've seen North Korea launch many missile provocations this year, over the past 6 months. And there's talk of an impending nuclear test as well. And in light of these growing provocations from the North, how do you think South Korea and the United States should really approach the regime in engaging it in denuclearization talks and also responding to its hostilities?
Well, the first step is deterrence, and this is well appreciated in Seoul and Washington. The really dramatic growth in North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile capabilities do require adjustments. We've just seen North Korea signal that it wants to station tactical nuclear weapons on the front lines. Which is a really unfortunate development. So I think it will take a lot of work to establish how deterrence should work. But then we have to think about what happens next. What happens when North Korea is actually willing to talk again? Do we want to continue to talk under the rubric of denuclearization, even though we have to be honest, North Korea has shown no signs of actually wanting to completely dismantle its nuclear weapons capabilities? Perhaps a more pragmatic framework under the rubric of normalization would be more productive. We've lived with a North Korean nuclear capability, unfortunately, for quite some time. What we have to do is focus on avoiding a conflict and making some diplomatic progress.
And at the NATO summit, the leaders of South Korea, the United States and Japan will be meeting on the sidelines to hold a trilateral summit. And what kinds of discussions do you expect to take place, based on North Korea, of course?
Yeah, I think North Korea will be at the top of the agenda for the trilateral meeting. This is the first one in about 5 years, so it's very significant. I'm not sure I have too high hopes, given that there are elections for Japan's, the upper house of its parliament coming up next month. But perhaps this is the beginning of some progress in the trilateral relationship, which is an important priority for Washington. And in addition to discussing extended nuclear deterrence and other issues pertaining to North Korea, perhaps there could be even some progress in bringing Seoul and Tokyo together. There are, of course, export controls that Japan has placed on chemicals that are needed for South Korea's semiconductor industry. So perhaps in the months and years to come, we'll see some better relations between those two countries, as well as a new concept for deterring North Korea.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, so this is where we'll have to leave the interview. But thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Hyman. I hope you enjoyed your trip in Seoul, despite the humidity and the rain that we've seen.
Very much so. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Hyman.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Protests continued over the weekend across the US following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the constitutional right to have an abortion. The ruling was made in a 6-3 conservative majority vote and will likely see more than half of the US states implement or consider a ban on abortion. Speaking in the wake of the ruling on Sunday, leading Democratic women Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called on President Joe Biden and Congress to protect abortion rights by using federal land as a safe haven for those who wish to have an abortion. The measure could be used in states that ban or severely restrict the practice. Going further, Senator Warren added that the Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy and needs more justices.
I believe we need to get some confidence back in our court, and that means we need more justices on the United States Supreme Court.
Meanwhile, celebrities have had their say on the landmark decision, with Marvel star Chris Hemsworth saying it is a massive step backwards, while singers Olivia Rodrigo and Lily Allen performed a song at the Glastonbury Music Festival in response to the ruling. 22 young adults have been found dead at a nightclub in South Africa in the southeastern town of East London. Local authorities said residents reported finding the bodies on Sunday morning at Enyobeni Tavern in Scenery Park following end of school year celebrations. The cause of the deaths is still under investigation, with experts carrying out toxicology tests to see if the victims were poisoned, as they carried no visible wounds. Speaking during his trip to the G7 summit, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa voiced his condolences over the incident. The weekend saw annual Pride parades take place across the world from Mexico City to Paris and Toronto. But Pride celebration planned in Turkey's Istanbul came to a halt as authorities blocked hundreds of people from gathering for the city parade on Sunday, while dozens more were arrested. This comes after local officials banned the march again this year in light of a toughened stance on LGBTQ freedoms by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Meanwhile, a deadly shooting took place in the early hours of Saturday in and nearby a gay bar in the Norwegian capital, Oslo. The incident came just ahead of the city's annual Pride Festival and is being investigated as a terrorist attack. 2 people were killed and 21 wounded in the shooting not long before the start of the Oslo Pride Parade. Police in Norway say they're investigating it as a terrorist incident because of the number of dead and injured. The suspect is a Norwegian citizen of Iranian descent who was caught at the scene. The Pride Parade was officially cancelled, but hundreds of people demonstrated near the scene later in the day. As many football leagues take their summer break, Poland is offering avid football fans another kind of tournament, the Swampians League. The event, named after the Champions League, took place over 2 days on Saturday and Sunday. Poland's northeast city of Korysin hosted the teams from Poland and Ukraine for the annual muddy competition. Now in its 6th year, the event saw 6 women's and 22 men's teams take part. The event's organizers said the contest can help people decompress and shows that even in dark times, life can be normal. Swamp football's origins are believed to come from Finland as a way to improve the stamina of soldiers as well as athletes. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good morning. Monsoon rain makes its return at the start of the last week of June. Rain clouds are forming on the west coast, dropping rain on parts of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do this morning. And the further north you are, the heavier the rainfall you're going to receive through tomorrow. The capital region will be seeing rain after lunchtime. In fact, it's forecast to rain throughout the week. A heavy rain advisory has been issued in Ulsan and parts of Gyeongsang-Namdo province, while a heat advisory remains in place in Daegu and Gwangju and parts of Jeollado and Gyeongsang-do provinces. Speaking of heat, many regions, including here in Seoul, saw the season's first tropical night last night. It was the warmest June night in 25 years in the capital. And it's also a very warm night for many parts of the country, along with high humidity. The highs will not go up too high today. Seoul topping out at 26 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Gwangju topping out at 29 degrees this afternoon. But be mindful, when it starts to rain, it could really pour down. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's going to wrap up our newscast for this hour, but we'll be back tomorrow for our Tuesday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and do stick around for more updates throughout the day. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Goodbye.
you.